Good evening. I'm Milton Curry, Dean of the USC School of Architecture and the Della and Harry McDonald Dean's Chair in Architecture. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our second lecture in our spring public event series. Professor Fernando Lara is joining us this evening. And we'll be joined by our own Professor Luciana Barcugia, who will moderate our question and answer period following Fernando's lecture. I want to start by saying that for our community at USC Architecture and Los Angeles and the architecture discipline, we lost one of our treasured faculty members earlier this week, Professor Kim Coleman, architect and Professor Kim Coleman. And it's with a heavy heart that we have proceeded with our duties this week at USC Architecture, but we extend our best thoughts, prayers to her family, to her friends, to all the alumni that she touched, all of the former students she touched, and to all of you in our Los Angeles and Southern California community who knew her as a friend and as a colleague. So this is the first lecture that we've had, public lecture, since her passing, and I wanted to acknowledge in her honor that we will remember her and will be in touch with you, our community, about ways that we're going to be celebrating her life and work in the future. So please stay tuned and keep in touch with us. This evening's lecture is a kind of preamble to next week's Dean Creative Talk, Latin American Cities, where we will have an interdisciplinary panel from Mexico City. And in these and other activities, we as a school will are exploring how to conceptualize and relate to the contemporary politics, aesthetics, culture, and imaginary within Latin and South America, and the cultural exchanges that exist between the US and these individual and collective polities and countries. How can we participate and develop richer exchanges through research, global studies, global study programs, and other activities? The Western Hemisphere, Southern subcontinent of the Americas, South America, Latin America, Global South. We have lots of terms and names for nation states to the south of the United States. And today we're here in Los Angeles, what once was Mexican and indigenous lands. And colonization and authoritarian regimes, as we've learned in this country, are not unique to Latin America, where from our independence, they've had authoritarian governments having an impact on everything from the broader society, history, culture, politics, but also the built environment. And I'm so pleased today to welcome someone who can speak to all those issues and contextualize them in a way that integrates contemporary thinking in architectural theory and architectural history, issues of colonization, decolonization, Professor Fernando Lara. Professor Lara holds the Potter Rose Professorship in Urban Planning at the University of Texas at Austin, where he currently serves as director of the PhD program in architecture. He teaches seminars in 20th century Latin American architecture and urbanism, and a doctoral course on the critique of architectural ethnocentrism, as well as studios related to the continent's current urban challenges. He holds degrees from the Federal University of Minas Gerais and the University of Michigan. He works on theorizing spaces of the Americas with an emphasis on the dissemination of architecture and planning ideas beyond traditional disciplinary boundaries. He's one of the few Latin Americanists to traverse between Spanish and Lusophone cultures and architecture, histories, and geographies. He's written widely. Recent books include The Rise of Popular Modernist Architecture in Brazil, Modern Architecture in Latin America, Art, Technology, and Utopia. He wrote that with another expert in this area, Luis Carranza, and also Exceptional Brazilian Modern Architecture, along with edited volumes and journal essays. In his several articles, Professor Lara has discussed the modern and contemporary architecture of this continent, its meaning, context, and social economic insertion. As a member of the Brazilian Institute of Architects and the Brazilian Docomomo, Mr. Lara has also been active in his native country of Brazil as a critic, researcher, and educator. His current interest in the favelas has turned into opportunities to engage with public policy at the municipal level, as well as collaborations with local firms designing public spaces in informal settlements. In 2005, he founded Studio Toro, a nonprofit devoted to the challenges of water conservation and urban flooding in Latin America. Fernando, it's very great to have you here, and we welcome you, and I ask the audience to please join me in welcoming you to USC Architecture's lecture series.
Thank you so much, Dean Curry. It's an honor to be here with the USC community tonight. I am very interested in the kinds of conversation that you are having at USC. The idea of citizen architect resonates very closely to the kind of things that I'm thinking about and I'm writing about, as you will see tonight. So let me share my screen so we can start with my text, and I will be reading the text along the way. I struggled a bit with the title of this lecture because I'm not really a historian, I'm not really a theoretician, and then in the process of putting that together, I realized that I am an educator. I've been teaching for over 20 years. I started teaching in Brazil even before I got my PhD. So it's been a quarter century of teaching, and that's who I am. So 5 frameworks for decolonizing architectural education in the Americas. I think it's the ideal title for tonight. Let me start from those 233 small ceramic pieces that are mounted against a dark blue wall in the 19th floor of Edifício Copan in downtown São Paulo. In 2017, I was teaching as a visiting professor at the Instituto de Estudos Brasileiros at the University of São Paulo, where Luciana studied. And those ideas, the ideas that I will elaborate in those 5 frameworks, reached the curators of the 11th Bienal de Arquitetura de São Paulo. They invited me to do something for the Biennale, and being an academic, I immediately thought of something I could write. And I asked them how much space I could have. They told me that I could have a full wall at Biblioteca Mário de Andrade in downtown São Paulo. And in my mind, I was thinking of a full wall of text when they added that there was no need for more words. They were commissioning an installation. I said, okay, on the spot. We were at the IAB, the Brazilian Institute of Architects headquarters, downtown São Paulo. I left the meeting worried that I stepped way outside of my comfort zone. Later that summer, the project crystallized around a map formed by hundreds of small ceramic pieces, each representing one typology of the Americas. The work circulated between São Paulo, Austin, Texas, and with a special moment in Ouro Preto, and back to São Paulo. This is the image of the installation during the Biennale at the Biblioteca Mário de Andrade. In September of 2017, a few months later, my students here at Texas, they devised hundreds of facade drawings covering the entire built environment of our continent, from favelas and shotgun houses to the Salk Institute. From LA, we had the Eames House, Orquideorama from Bogota, the Brasilia Cathedral, etc. The drawings were abstracted and drawn in a mold of about 2 by 3 inches, and then carved with a laser cutter in either plexiglass or plywood. You see the molds there on the table. The small molds traveled with us to Ouro Preto in Minas Gerais in October and were pressed into clay at a ceramica there, as a proper ceramica place, during a frantic weekend in which we produced over 300 pieces. It was a beautiful moment in which students from Texas and Minas Gerais joined myself, the pottery workers, and colleagues from Goma Oficina, a collective in São Paulo, who helped me assemble the installation later, pressing those precise laser cut pieces into rebellious wet clay. The pieces were then fired on the traditional wood oven, and the ones representing iconic buildings were glazed with mineral pigments from that region, so they were fired again. A selection of 250 pieces were sent to São Paulo to be displayed at the Biennale. The Biennale was open to the public between November 2017 and January 2018. And later that year, Escola da Cidade, which is a school downtown São Paulo, proposed that the installation be mounted in their Copan apartment. They have an apartment at the Copan building, and they host visiting professors there. So if you ever go to lecture at Escola da Cidade, you might be lucky to be hosted in this apartment, to spend the night in this apartment. And I think you're gonna have a hard time choosing between looking at this installation or looking at the wonderful view of downtown São Paulo, the other side of the living room. But why did I start from this installation? To me, thinking about it now, 3 years after it was assembled, it's a synthesis of intellectual efforts behind my recent work. First of all, it was a piece designed and built in collaboration. More than 50 people came together to make it a reality. The collaborative nature of the installation brings it closer to the idea of pluriverse, as recently articulated by Arturo Escobar. The second main concept that we might extract from this piece is the educational consciousness component that brings a multiplicity of ideas to a wide audience. If we track those ideas into a map, we would have the opposite of the Bannister-Fletcher tree of architecture, as I will elaborate in a minute. Thirdly, the installation proposes new concepts for addressing parts of our knowledge that are insufficiently represented in the Western canon. Fourth, it was thought as an exercise to expand the boundaries of what we consider worthy of architectural scholarship. And last but not least, it addresses a very important discussion about what I call the double standards of knowledge and culture in architectural education. So as an outline for this lecture, I will talk about those 5 necessary frameworks that I think we need to use to decolonize architectural education in the Americas: the double standards of knowledge and culture, expanding the scholarship boundaries, new concepts for thinking about our own place, the Americas, multiplicity of influences, and collaboration towards an idea of a pluriverse. So bear with me. From the decolonial literature, I'm thinking here about Frantz Fanon, Eduard Said, Walter Mignolo, Gloria Anzaldúa. We learned that coloniality is made very visible in the way that we label some ideas as knowledge and other ideas as culture. In his classic Orientalism, Eduard Said explained how European scholars developed narratives about all the other societies on Earth, labeled them culture, and as a result, established themselves as a center of human knowledge. This map I drew about 15 years ago, 2005, and it has a dot for every building mentioned in our classic books that we use to teach modern architecture: William Curtis, Vincent Scully, Kenneth Frampton, Jean-Louis Cohen. The map says everything. Here, I need to call your attention to the use of knowledge referring to ideas and concepts from one part of the world, very explicit in this map, and culture as ideas and concepts from another part of the world, the white areas of the map, of course. Ask anybody, ask people what they think the best knowledge is located, and they will most inevitably answer Europe, United States, Japan. Ask the same people where they think the best cultures are located, and you get a much more diverse array of answers that spans from my native Brazil to Mexico, Turkey, India, Vietnam, Thailand, etc. You got it. Knowledge became synonymous with science and development, while culture became synonymous with tradition and underdevelopment. What Walter Mignolo calls epistemic disobedience is fundamental to dismantle the idea that the first world has knowledge and the third world has culture. Native Americans have wisdom, Anglo-Americans have science. We need to get rid of that. We need to invert that relationship and see culture and knowledge everywhere. It's not hard to challenge this assumption, for we know that there is a tremendous amount of knowledge in every human society. And for instance, there is no rational explanation or any data supporting the idea that people in the US believe that guns make them safer. It's culture, right? So how come some parts of the world became associated with knowledge and others associated with culture? What are the processes that built that difference? And how can we start to dismantle what we call epistemic colonization? The premise that Western civilization ideas and values are better than everybody else's. And most important for our design disciplines in the Americas, what is the role of architecture and planning in this construction? We did play a role. We have responded to this challenge for many decades already, although this knowledge is only slowly being absorbed by architectural scholarship. In the late 1950s, Edmund O'Gorman, brother of architect Juan O'Gorman, demonstrated that it was the encounter with the Americas that triggered European modernization, not the other way around. In the 1970s, we have Aníbal Quijano in Peru, Milton Santos in Brazil, Pablo González Casanova in Mexico, all of them working on different aspects of colonialism or coloniality as the basic understanding for underdevelopment and inequality. In 1992, the 500th anniversary of the arrival of Colombo in our continent, Aníbal Quijano synthesized the argument with the idea that, quote, it's not that the Americas had a significant role in the development of capitalism, it's that there would be no capitalism if not for the European occupation of the Americas, end quote. Later in this lecture, I will borrow from Quijano to elaborate that it's not that the Americas had a significant role in the development of architecture as we know it, is that there would be no modern architecture is not for the European occupation of the Americas. Back to the brief chronology of the colonial theory, 1995 was a key year because in the same year that Enrique Dussel published his lectures on the invention of the Americas and Arturo Escobar published Encountering Development. Together, they taught us that there is no modernization without colonization, and that's a key concept. Modernization and colonization are one and the same. Dismantling the epistemic coloniality that is still hegemonic on higher education all over the world is our intellectual way of bringing down statutes and statues. Thinking about here in the south of the US, all those Confederate monuments that were built on white supremacy and exploitation. So how is the colonial dichotomy of knowledge and culture reflected in architecture? One quick look into our survey books that teach architectural history can illuminate a very strong answer. The Bannister Fletcher book, for instance, first published in 1896, called A History of Architecture on the Comparative Method. Given how Anglo-centric it is, one can infer that the comparative method was there precisely to justify their knowledge against everybody else's culture, as I will elaborate later still in this lecture. For now, let's just remember that as a small gesture to the US, they included in the 1919 edition a few buildings by Sullivan, Root, Bunham, McKean, Mead, and White, with the comment that those were the result of, quote, abnormal progress of American industries during the last 25 years, end quote. Going back to normal, their comment on Mesoamerican pre-Columbian architecture is that, I quote again, it's so unimportant in its general aspect that a few words will suffice to explain its character, end quote. The trend of using derogatory words to justify the erasure of any architecture that does not fit the narrative of European superiority is very long. We find it in every major piece of scholarship of the 20th century, from Pevsner in 1942 to William Curtis in 1982. this explicit Eurocentrism or NATO-centrism, as I would like to say, because the east coast of the US is included in that in the second half of the 20th century, reached this climax on William Curtis' statement that modern architecture is the, quote, intellectual property of the West, end quote. After that, that was already 1982, the derogatory view of non-European architecture starts to thin out. Spiro Kostoff expanded significantly the geographic scope of the survey in architectural history when he published in 1985 the Settings and Rituals. Further, this was pushed by Richard Inglesall, Shin, Jarzombek, and Prakash, and most recently by Kathleen James Chakraborty. An analysis of the bibliography and further readings of all those contemporary books show two serious shortcomings. And this is an article that I published this year, 2021 already, about this topic in a journal in Argentina. The serious shortcomings are pre-modern, non-Western examples have been included in much higher number than modern ones. And number two, their citations are still overwhelmingly in English only. To be fair, the majority of my Latin American colleagues did not cite each other either. We were all trained under heavy epistemic coloniality. Latin American scholars like myself were conditioned to reference only the knowledge of Northern authors, not their own culture. Second framework that I present for decolonizing architectural education, expanding the scholarship boundaries. A little over 20 years ago, I was doing my PhD research on Brazilian vernacular modernism, and I faced senior scholars such as Kenneth Frampton and Stanford Anderson. And they questioned why I was spending my time studying buildings not designed by architects. When I presented an essay suggesting that the Corbusier domino is the DNA of all favela structures around the world, 6 columns, 2 slabs, reinforced concrete, Jean-Louis Cohen told me that I was denigrating the work of the French-Swiss master. Looking back on those years, and I presented that in the early 2000s, I think I was trying to decolonize myself. I did spend the first 2 decades of my academic life adjectivizing Latin American modernism. I wrote about it being a peripheral modernism or conservative modernity or insufficient modernity. Only after reading Mignolo and Escobar, and I only read them, I read them with a lag of about 10 years. They wrote in the mid to late 90s. I wrote them between 2008 and 2015. Only then I understood that coloniality is inherent to any modernity. Nevertheless, I'm proud of my fight for encompassing the totality of the built environment as our object of study. To end this brief biographical diversion, I need to confess that years later, Frampton got his revenge when he reminded me that in the end, I did what he told me to do. I wrote the book of the historical canonical buildings of Latin America in reference to this book that I co-wrote with Luis Carranza, by the way, USC alum. Modern Architecture in Latin America, Art, Technology, and Utopia was published in 2015. My main point here is that we need to expand the knowledge base of our discipline as a whole. The old unspoken definition of architecture as buildings designed by famous architects do not hold water anymore. It's extremely self-referential. A few decades of gender, race, and ethnic decolonization has made evident how much this old idea is self-referential. It defines architecture as a work done by white males because all layers of the profession, training, commissioning, curating, publishing, writing, is dominated by white males. I feel indebted to both Berkeley and MIT as references when I reflect on my own scholarship, as much as I'm indebted to the FAUSP in São Paulo for the socioeconomic focus, Valparaíso in Chile for their experimental characters, or the Canadian school's valorization of First Nations knowledge. If Berkeley taught me to look vertically into our high-low architectural relationship, the vernacular, GAHTC and MIT explored the NATO-centric limitations as developed during the 20th century historiography. But the most transformative concepts for me came from Latin America. Milton Santos, Walter Mignolo, Arturo Escobar, Aníbal Quijano, Silvia Rivera Crucicanti, Maria Lugones, Denise Ferreira da Silva. Together, they taught me to break the epistemological barriers that define architecture not done by Anglo-white males as peripheral. And also important, I discovered them in the order that I just read their names, with the fundamental contribution of female scholars arriving quite recently. As an expert on Latin American modern architecture, I wrote extensively on the need to include the region into a broader conversation, albeit framed by its own concepts. I also wrote extensively on the popular dissemination of modernist vocabulary all the way to the favela structures. Most of my work before 2018 fits in one or the other direction of expanding the boundaries of the field. In that process, I learned that a key difference between structures designed by trained architects and those built by non-architects is the role of abstraction. Students of architecture know that the process of design abstraction was developed in the 15th and 16th century. It is no coincidence that the European occupation of the Americas happened at exactly the same time. And I have discussed it at length in this paper published last year. It is a disciplinary consensus that abstraction is the main component of the modern process of design. My work on documenting and analyzing favela structures have taught me that abstraction is indeed the main difference between what is design and what is not. What the colonial theorists taught me most recently is that abstraction is not only an accelerator of improvement, but also an accelerator of modernity and consequentially an accelerator of coloniality. The very process of slicing an object into plane, section, elevation is a process of reduction. We discard information in order to be able to manipulate what we consider essential. But what if the treasure lies in the information discarded? We would never know that we threw the baby out with the bathwater if we never accepted that there was a baby there. My point here, learn from contemporary scholars that engage indigenous knowledge, note that I use knowledge, not culture, in an effort of epistemic decolonization, is that the rise of abstraction in the 16th century killed relational processes that we need to bring back to the table. In the case of the built and the natural environment, the rise of abstraction as the only possible process of analysis gave us the tragic idea that male Homo sapiens rules and everything non-male, non-white, and worse, non-sapiens should be at their disposal. To understand the need for relational processes as antidote to the dark consequences of abstraction processes implies reevaluating the very concept of space that lies at the basis of our discipline. For Space is the title of a book by Doreen Massey, published in 2005. For Massey, modernity has reduced space to a surface, removing any depth that would come from understanding its multiple temporalities, its history. The separation between geography, now understood as homogeneous surface, and history or histories is the key paradigm shift that followed the European occupation of the Americas. No wonder that Doreen Massey starts her book by describing the encounter between Moctezuma and Cortés in 1519, so almost exactly 500 years ago. Both leaders were speaking about widely different ideas. And this is the map of the Aztec Empire drawn by the Aztec craftsmen that ended up in Spain. They were both talking about widely different ideas of time and space as they strode Tenochtitlan together. Moctezuma was immersed into that space as an authoritarian leader, yes, but one that did not separate himself from his people, the goods and lands under his government. Cortés, on the contrary, developed the ability to remove himself from all that history in order to see only space that could serve his goals of riches and power. Back to Doreen Massey's concept of space as a potential overlapping of multiple histories, I would highlight that such multiplicity goes head on against the process of dimensional reduction that was being developed by architects around that same time. The abstraction that is so keen for every architect after the Renaissance is manifest in the very process of descriptive geometry that we associate with Gaspar Monge in the 18th century, but in the reality can be traced back to Albrecht Dürer. I can't pronounce that. My German is way too bad, but this is the Underweisung der Messung mit dem Zirkel und Richtscheit. Sorry, I have a Brazilian German. From 1525. What Cortés was doing in Tenochtitlan was simultaneously being codified by Dürer in Nuremberg. Of course, this is no coincidence. The colonial theory has stressed over and over that everything what we call modernity has been deeply influenced by European occupation of the Americas. Doreen Massey's key contribution is to highlight the homogenization and simplification that happen when we start manipulating space as surfaces. She defended the idea of space as, I quote, constituted through interactions from the immensity of the global to the intimately tiny, end quote. Such multivariant space is also never finished. It's always in the process of being made, which again, once again, goes again the architectural idea that we control spaces. We don't. They'll go back to it at the very end of the lecture. In summary, Doreen Massey advocates for a relational understanding of space, something that is very much anti-modern and was already indigenous to the Americas. Now, 1 century after the European occupation of the Americas, we arrive at René Descartes. The discourse on method is undoubtedly a major synthesis of such modern concept of space as a surface available for the benefit of European minds. The true contribution of Cartesian syllogism, cogito ergo sum, is the prominence of space over matter. We need to question the neutrality of the ego as a producer of unbiased knowledge, when all it's doing is split subject and object under the disguise of abstraction to achieve control over all others. Any knowledge that claims to be situated in body politics, and I think here of Gloria Anzaldúa, Frantz Fanon, Paul B. Preciado, or the geopolitics of knowledge, thinking of Enrique Dussel and Walter Mignolo, as opposed to the myth of unsituated knowledge of the Cartesian ego-politics, is discarded as biased, invalid, irrelevant. Abstraction, as the definition goes, implies freedom from representation and the quality of dealing with ideas rather than events. Whether we are free from representation or not is an argument for another lecture. But my thesis here is that we are not free from representation. Modernity was created when we abandoned any relational knowledge and adopted a superficial, in the sense of what occurs on the surface, understanding of space in which the controlling white man is removed from every non-man, non-white beings are reduced to objects to be plotted and therefore controlled. So in order to question that or delink that or disassemble that, we need new concepts. The old concepts will not be sufficient. They are fundamental, but they will not be sufficient. So in February of 2020, the PhD program in architecture here at UT Austin partnered with the University of Cambridge to host a colloquium on decolonizing the spatial history of the Americas. 23 scholars came from 21 universities in 7 countries to present their research and discuss their latest efforts of epistemic decolonization in architecture and urbanism. Keynote lectures by Arturo Escobar, Clara Irazabal, and Felipe Hernandez set the tone of the conversation, and our UT community of scholars provided the context for rich discussions. And we were so lucky that this happened 3 weeks before everything shut down and nobody could travel anymore. If we're going to raise the understanding of the American built environment to the level that we have when we discuss European architecture, we need American concepts and American frameworks. Not that we need to forget our own Western knowledge, because it is fundamental, but it is insufficient. In architectural history, we lag behind art history, and we are still searching for new words to describe and discuss our own spaces. We have by now lived for way too long with our European knowledge base, and we need to re-empathize, to create empathy with our own spaces, our words, our own idiosyncrasies. How can we discuss Brasilia, for instance, and not see the labor relations that are embedded in that construction process, or the destruction of the Brazilian Cerrado and the Mata Atlântica, where all the wood that used to build all that formwork came from? How can we discuss the Chicago School of the late 19th century and not see the issues of settler coloniality plus the layer of segregation that was embedded in the US at that time? How can we discuss the UNAM in Mexico City, the campus, and not see the racial inequality that pushed mestizo peasants out of their collective land, the ejido, so that the Creole elite of Mexico would have a world-class university? How can we discuss some of Philip Johnson ideas and not others? Felipe Hernandez and I are editing a forthcoming book in which we will discuss that through 7 concepts: abstraction, agriculture, visuality, gender, water, race, and labor. And this is part of what I have been writing for a while. I call the attention to the Architectural Review because they are publishing a series of very interesting articles in all those contemporary topics and frameworks. But we also need my 4th concept, multiplicity of influences. The opening of new avenues of analysis towards our built environment will reveal not only its hidden facets, but also a whole new set of influences that lie at the other end of the thread. The Eurocentric narrative gave us a very restricted historical sequence that brings to the fore the Greek, Roman, Gothic, Renaissance, Neoclassic, modern styles or synthesis, pushing everything else to the background or further into oblivion. James Blount, for instance, explained the fallacy of diffusionism, the construction of a single European origin for ideas and concepts. No image captures the concept of such construction better than the tree of architecture from Bannister Fletcher 20th century editions. The first edition of the Bannister Fletcher survey was published in 1896. And initially it was a survey of European architecture only. After 1901, prepared by Sir Bannister Fletcher, the son, they separated the survey into historical styles of European architecture and non-historical styles of Asian, Middle Eastern, and Central America construction knowledges. And you can imagine that we were relegated to the known history. That's why I go back to the idea of space, because one of the consequences of the European occupation of the Americas is that our continent was seen as space only and void of history. And that goes back to this construction. And I can't believe that this book won a RIBA award last year in 2020. They're still celebrating it and giving it awards. Anyways, 1 century ago, in the 1919 edition, they hinted at the great future of American architecture, based in their own words, as I said before, on the abnormal progress of American industries. If they had stopped there, all Anglophone architecture students before the 1950s would learn that in 1919, all that new American architecture was very fresh and therefore worthy of 3 out of 780 pages. But being good gatekeepers of established artistic values, Bannister Fletcher Jr., or Sir Bannister Fletcher, had to write on page 656 when mentioning Mexican architecture before 1492, that it was, as I said before, so unimportant in its general aspect that a few words will suffice to explain its character, end quote. Unfortunately, such dismissal was the rule, not the exception. Hired by Napoleon III, who invaded Mexico in 1861, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc produced one of the most heinous ethnocentric narratives in the annals of architectural history. Viollet-le-Duc never set foot in Mexico, but he wrote 64 pages based on photographs, illustrations, and field notes compiled under the leadership of Désiré Charnay. Unable to accept that Toltecs, Olmecs, Mayas, and Aztecs built such magnificent architecture, Viollet-le-Duc hypothesized that some construction techniques were surely imported from Scandinavia, Japan, or Mediterranean civilizations. To justify the lack of evidence of travel across thousands of miles between the Central Valley of Mexico and Newfoundland in Canada, where the knowledgeable Europeans had landed, Viollet-le-Duc proposed that the Europeans were too civilized and therefore too soft to amount the amount of labor and resources needed to build such structures. Only when they were later conquered by the bellicose Aztecs and Mayas, wrote Viollet-le-Duc, the Europeans' knowledge materialized into such large buildings, because when they passed their techniques to those barbarians, they were able to amass the necessary resources to build that much. That's a pillar of our architectural knowledge, right? Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. It's there, you can read it. But let me go back to Bannister Fletcher 6th edition, published in 1921, because it included for the first time the American United States architecture at the very top of the illustration of the tree of architecture. The Eurocentric trunk of Greek, Roman, Gothic, Renaissance, Neoclassic, modern styles are now crowned by an American flower. Its whitewashed pollen assuring that only styles of European lineage would now populate those other lands. As any contemporary scholar knows, the design of this trunk is a powerful narrative that works as much to maintain the centrality of European episteme as to keep all other architectural manifestations peripheral and secondary, minor branches to the true knowledge of Western civilization. Walter Mignolo and Enrique Dussel wrote extensive literatures discussing how Europe invented herself and the role of the Americas in this process. Pushing Edward Said's concept westbound, Orientalism can be seen as a precursor to the understanding that the West is an ideological construct that operates by selecting few and far between ancient roots, ancient sources, to draft a coherent narrative that upholds European centrality. In the words of Enrique Dussel, and I quote, "This was an ideological invention that first kidnapped Greek culture as exclusively Western and European, and then posited both the Greek and Roman cultures as the center of the world history. This perspective can be considered erroneous from two standpoints. First, there was not yet a world history in an empirical sense before 1492. That's what Dussel is referring to. There were only isolated local histories of communities that extended over large geographical areas. The Romans, the Persians, the Hindu, the Siamese, the Chinese, the Mesoamerican, and Inca worlds in the Americas. Second, their geopolitical locations did not allow them, the Europeans, to be a center. The Red Sea or Antioch was the final destination of commerce with the East, was not the center, was the westernmost border of the Euro-Afro-Asian market. The argument for a more complex and contradictory narrative is summarized in this diagram published by Dussel. And it's not hard to apply the same diagram to the history of architecture to understand that we need a much more complex history, moving way beyond the romantic reductionism of the Eurocentric trunk. And I repeat, the Eurocentric trunk of Greek, Roman, Gothic, Renaissance, Neoclassic, Modern, American, or Usonian. The reality is much more complex than the Western historiography of art and architecture wants us to believe. A full dismantling of the Eurocentric stylistic axis will only be achieved when we understand the complex relationships between Eurasian and North African cultures, bringing Hindus, Mongols, Persians, Chinese, Slavs, Egyptians, Turks into the picture, to be confronted with the Olmecs, Toltecs, Mayas, Paracas, Mapuches, Tupis, and Chimus that had their own building cultures on the other side of either one of our two large oceans. And then, of course, I have to use the image of the Mapuche flag flying on top of the statue of General Baquedano in Santiago de Chile, 2019. Much like our modern cuisine, our modern architecture is the result of a plethora of influences. What the hegemonic Eurocentrism sells us as Italian pasta is in reality a combination of an Andean fruit, the tomato, with a Chinese technique of making wheat dough into wires. Kudos for the 16th century Napolitans for putting it together. But why have we not celebrated the diversity of sources of the Renaissance? And 50 years ago, people like Samuel Egerton have demonstrated that Brunelleschi learned as much from his Islamic optical treatise as from the Greeks and medieval knowledge about vision. And this is still not taught in architecture schools. If you want to know everything about my own bias, look not at what I write, but what I overlook, what I do not write. So my final concept, collaboration towards a pluriverse. 30 years ago, I was an architecture student in Minas Gerais, Brazil. And I was an intern in an office that was building a cultural center in a small town 50 miles away with a very precarious budget. My job was to oversee specifications and details with weekly visits to the job site. One day, I arrived there, and this is a photo of the building, and the triangular windows designed for the hallway had been corrected by the masons. They were, instead of triangles aligned to the side, they were built aligned by the top, which is of course much easier to do in brick masonry. This was before cell phones. So at the end of the day, I drove back to the office to report how the construction workers had ruined their design ideas and see what we should do about it. As I told the story with an exasperation of a student that still believed that architects should control every minor detail of whatever we design, one of the partners walked to an adjacent room and brought back to our table a frame that was hanging on the wall there. It showed a mandala with a circular saying, all humans are architects because all design is probabilistic. And you can read it, all design is probabilistic because all humans are architects. The message there was quite shocking to me. It stood against everything I had learned in 3 years of architecture school at the time. What do you mean all design is probabilistic? What do you mean every human is architect? Why am I going through a 5-year college, it took me 6, to learn something that every human being already knows? Reflecting back 30 years ago, I think I was very lucky to learn that very early on. And I try to convey this to as many students as I can. Unlike what is written in the annals of the profession, and in almost every architectural book written in the 20th century, the design of the built environment is a very complex operation that involves hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. The probabilistic part of the mandala reminds us that there is only a chance, small or large, that things will be built according to our specifications. The human as architect part reminds us that every person called to work on the built environment, from the client paying to it with a lot of power to the most humble immigrant staying in the hardwood floors, will impact the final product. Back to Escobar's idea of radical relationality, all entities that make up the world are so deeply interrelated that they have no intrinsic separate existence by themselves. A closer look into old architectural treatises will show that most architects of the remote past understood this well and wrote about their apprentices, their stonecutters, their carpenters' role in completion of a building. Sometime around the late 19th century, all other workers disappear from the narrative, and we have the rise of the genius architect. It is no coincidence that this heroic and whitewashed narrative coincides with scientific racism and the rise of eugenics. That relationship has been discussed by many scholars recently, and it's urgent that we all get familiar with it. The contemporary reckoning of architecture with its racial, ethnical, and gender inequalities have helped us overcome the myth of the genius hero architect. So much so that most of the offices that our current students admire are collectives. Collectives work under much more horizontal and participatory structure and respond better to the issues of the 21st century. Traditional firms, still the majority of the design industry, are based on a vertical hierarchical structure that inevitably have white males at the top and non-white, non-males at the bottom, if they have any at all. My point here is that the current push to diversify architecture and design will not be enough to transform the profession if the power structure remains stratified and hierarchical. The economic inequality in our society is such that it will take generations for the majority of non-white and non-male beings to rise to position of power on equal numbers. As important as supporting diversity it is to overcome the economic and epistemological structure that created such lack of diversity. And I wrap up this lecture going back to Arturo Escobar. After retiring as emeritus professor of anthropology at the University of North Carolina, Escobar has devoted his energy and knowledge to build a better future. In that capacity, he wrote 2 books on design, and he's probably writing others this very moment. The first book, Design for the Pluriverse, explored the theories around design and their potential to transform the world. The idea of pluriverse, as defined by Escobar, encompasses both the higher degree of diversity and the highest degree of autonomy, reminding us that universes are many and should remain many. The Western episteme that we now operate under have reduced the idea of universality to a single Cartesian entity. And here, I do not mean that we should discard the knowledge accumulated by Western civilization that gave us the Anthropocene. Western knowledge is fundamental. I mean, how else could we develop a vaccine in 10 to 11 months? Only using the ideas of abstraction and the scientific methods that came out of that modernization process. But we also need to extend the vaccine and clean water and sanitation and safety and education and opportunities to everybody, right? That's the coloniality part of it. Western knowledge is fundamental, but insufficient. The idea of pluriverse as proposed by Escobar addresses exactly those insufficiencies and opens up the possibility of many autonomous knowledges, interacting towards a better life for all. At this point, I go back to the first dichotomy of knowledge and culture to show how brainwashed we have been. The idea that all cultures have the right to coexist is by now a civilizational consensus. However, the idea that different knowledge systems should also coexist finds a much harder acceptance. The power of Escobar's pluriverse is that we not even need to imagine the end of capitalism. It's sufficient to imagine a capitalism that ensures dignity and health for all. Or perhaps we do need to imagine the end of it, for the autonomy and the agency embedded in the concept of pluriverse will force our economic structure to operate in a manner that might not be called capitalism anymore. To end with an optimistic note, Escobar's latest work engaged with design as a tool for building a better world. In that probabilistic potential for every human to modify its environment lies the transformative potential of design. After 1492, design became the political technology of modernity. Now, if engaged collectively and inclusively, it entails a conversation about possibilities of being, doing, and knowing. I love to remind our students that architecture has the power to envision the future. We give form to what do not yet exist. And that is not only a powerful gift, but also a heavy responsibility. If we design walls and prisons, the world will find ways to separate people and put children in cages. If we design bridges and shelters, the world will find ways to come together and protect each other. I think this is the citizenship that USC talks about. The urgency of decolonizing architecture goes beyond challenging the Eurocentric narrative or fighting for more diversity in the ranks of the profession. It entails designing a whole new pluriverse, envisioning spaces and objects that will foster the best in all of us. Thank you. I think I finished right in time.
Thank you, Fernando, for the provocations. This is a great lecture, and I think there was a lot of very good provocations. I also ended up doing my course in 6 years instead of 5 back in Brazil. So I think we have, I do have questions myself, but I also want to open to the Q&A more regarding how much time we have, how we are doing with time. I'm also not quite sure how much time we have for the Q&A, or Esmeralda, I think we, can I just start? Maybe I'm just gonna, I think I do, before I kind of open to the Q&A, so I do have a question. I think I see, okay, so we have around 20 minutes or 30. So I think you mentioned, right, I think there's a lot of good provocations there, Fernando, and I don't know even if my question is gonna contradict the table, right, that you read, that you're, when you were working in Brazil, right, as an intern, suddenly one of the
mandala.
Yeah. Yes, the mandala. So if, right, but I think I'm just also looking at all the materials that you wrote, and I'm thinking, right, if and you are now lecturing in an architecture school, you're also an educator, right? And I'm kind of wondering if parts of that training of, right, who architects are, and if there is a new order, right, that we have to imply somehow, and maybe that starts from education. I think that's my question, right? Would that also start from, do we have to shake that order inside the educational institution, right? So that we are training people that can open their minds to not just learning one kind of architecture, but open up to other kind of architecture that you're pointing out as a direction that is definitely important for us to be looking at. Like you mentioned, the local communities, right? And understanding the way that they built and their provocation with Frampton in the terms of looking at that and see some parallels also with architects are not. So is that something that we should start from? Where should we start from? Is that a starting point? Should the institutions, the educational institutions, be one of those starting points?
Yeah, right. The issue of that I discussed, I don't know if I said in the lecture or if I said in the brief conversation before we started, that I struggle with the title of this lecture. In the book that this text is a chapter, it has a different title. I struggle myself with my own identity. So I teach architectural theory, I teach architectural history, I taught studio, and I think this versatility has helped me in a sense, but it also avoids easy definitions, right? My studio colleagues think I'm too much of a PhD person. My historian colleagues think I work too much in studio. So I do struggle with that, and in a way I'm happy that I am not defined in any of the niches of inside the structure of academia. What I am, and I am happy to wear that hat forever, is an educator. I had some chances to practice. I had more chances of consulting, but in the end, I've been teaching architecture for over 25 years, and that's the core of my my profession. That's the core of my identity. So I don't feel completely comfortable telling design professionals what they should do. I don't feel completely comfortable telling architectural historians what they should do. I engage with them, but I feel much more comfortable discussing pedagogy and curriculum and how we should teach architecture, because that's the core of my existence for the last quarter century, so half my life.
Thank you, Fernando. Let's open. I see one question on the Q&A, but I want to make sure that we also bring more questions to Fernando first to keep this conversation going. So, okay, so one of the questions from the Q&A, you mentioned that you studied the structures built by non-architects. Mm-hmm. How did you go about doing so? Yes,
great. This work is my PhD dissertation. I have to start by saying that I grew up in Brazil and I was very used to modern architecture in everybody's houses. My grandparents' house was very modern. The apartment building where I lived with my parents were very modern. My school was very modern. And when I came to the US to do my PhD in Ann Arbor, Michigan, I drove around and where are the modernist beautiful buildings? They are so scattered. They are a few in the periphery of Detroit, or the beautiful houses that I saw in the architectural magazines in the 1980s and early 90s. They are so hidden. They are in the shores of Lake Michigan, but you don't see them. What you see is a housing environment that looks 18th and 19th century to me. Those houses are brand new, but look old. My dissertation work came out of that schizophrenia, that dichotomy of trying to explain why modernism was so much more popular, much more disseminated in Brazil. And in order to do that, I went to document houses built in the 1950s that had modern facades. They had butterfly roofs, inverted roofs. They had very thin metallic columns. They had little ceramic tiles, pastillas, we call chiclets in the US, I think, the tiny little tiles of 1 by 1 inch. They had all those elements of modern architecture, but they were not designed by architects. So I documented those houses. I went to the city archives to find their approved design, what was filed there. And I talked to the owners, and I look at the media, because the media, especially magazines in the 1950s, were using modern architecture to sell everything, to sell cars, to sell toothpaste, to sell kitchen appliances. Modern architecture was everywhere. And so I did that work. I documented them. I redrew those facades. I did formal analysis. But I also learned something very interesting when I talked to the owners of the houses that were all grandparents in the late 1990s. They were all grandparents because they had built the homes 40, 45 years before. That the vectors of dissemination were people, not the media, not the magazines, people. It's always they knew somebody who worked on a construction company, or somebody gave them a copy of the plans of a large wealthy house and they just shrunk the house to the size that they could build. So there's always a person being the vector of that work. And in the second work that I did, when I started my career as assistant professor, I went to talk to those construction workers. I went to interview those construction workers because they built those houses. They were the main vectors, and they also built the favelas. So they took me to the favelas to show me their homes. And when they wanted to discuss innovations, the kinds of windows, kind of spatiality, kinds of roof materials, kind of ceramic tiles, they wanted me to show their homes that they built, and they built either in the outmost periphery or in the favelas. So that was the trigger. Took me to understand the favela structures and to see Corbusier's domino in those structures. Because now, after I saw them from the first time, I can't not see them. I look at every building in Heliópolis or Vidigal, two favelas in São Paulo and Rio, and I see the domino in every structure. 6 columns and 2 slabs. They are everywhere. So that's what I did. But the main thing is that those structures, especially the favela ones, they were not designed. There was not a single drawing before construction started. So it's a complete reversal of the process, which is also really interesting, because in the normal world, first we have land ownership, then we have design, construction, and at the end, occupation. In the favela, it's the precise opposite. First you have occupation, then you have construction. And many, many years later, if you were lucky, you have land ownership. And there's never design. There's never the anticipation of no step of the construction process. They only think about the windows when the walls are 3 feet tall. And in that sense, nothing is anticipated. And it's also not efficient at all. It's a ton of waste and very problematic. I had many of my students visit favelas and document pathologies, right? The walls crack, the water infiltration, problem with the plumbing, terrible ventilation. It goes on and on and on. It's not. I mean, there's people do whatever they can with their resources, but that doesn't mean that that is a good place to live. No, it's not. I'll stop because I can talk for hours.
And I see some very good questions coming up. So I want to make sure that we try to cover as much as we can. So here's another one. You mentioned that in the creation of plans, sections, elevations, valuable information is often lost. How do we avoid this, and what alternatives are there?
That's the million-dollar question. I am advocating for us to bring other layers of information into the design process. Layers like memories, emotions, reactions, on top of, I mean, it's common to see studios that deals with sound or smell as multiple layers. in the design process, but what about emotions? What about memories? What about attachment to a place? What about my grandmother used to live close by, or or this is sacred land for my group, or there's a terrible history of a tragedy that happened here. All those layers are there, and we need to bring them back to the design process. Our design process was synthesized to avoid those issues, and we need to bring them back. And there's people already doing that. I see Atelier Bow bringing those questions into the design process. I see many young collectives designing in a very participatory way. We are getting there. The School of Talca in Chile, for instance, has an amazing pedagogy that brings those things to center visibility. We are getting there. I don't know exactly how. I don't have the recipe, but I am positive that we need to move that way.
Thanks, Fernando. Professor Lara described his own education at Berkeley and the MIT, and through the publications he spoke of so eloquently. Looking at those walls of books behind him and behind Dean Curry, I wonder who will write the history of what we used to call architecture, that old product of abstraction of Bannister Fletcher or Pevsner, of the idea of the lone genius.
This history is already written. I want to write the other one. This one is here. This history is here, already written in this wall of knowledge that sustains me. I'm really interested in the knowledge that I don't have. And I tell you a very short story if we have time. A few years ago, I was writing a piece for a magazine about native Brazilians. It's a tribe in Pernambuco, Brazil. They are what we call in Brazil Índios, native Brazilians. And they were bringing back together traditional construction knowledges. And they were recuperating the ancient ways of building with the help of some young architects. And the young architects who contacted me and asked me to write for their publication told me, you have to talk to the cacique. You have to talk to the leader of them. I said, okay, how? I live in Austin, Texas. No, he has a WhatsApp. I'll send you his WhatsApp number, his mobile phone number, and you can send him a message. And I sent a message, he replied a few hours later, and we set up some time, and I called. And when I called, I was talking about the process. A brilliant young man. Recently, he was elected mayor of his city of Pesqueira in Pernambuco. But I was talking to him about that knowledge. And at some point, I asked what the young architects asked me to ask. I mean, ask him how he chooses the site. How does he chooses the site for the building? They built like the communal house, the house where they do festivities and ceremonies. So I asked him. So I said, Lula, the architect, asked me to explain to me how you choose the site. And then he said, I did it the traditional way, Fernando. I woke up one morning and I walked in the field and I saw a bird landing. It's an Emma bird. It's like a road runner, a small ostrich that they have in Brazil. And where the bird landed, where the Emma landed, that's where we built the communal house. Okay, how do I write this? How do I explain to my audience that this man gave the bird the choice of choosing the site? I don't have the words. I don't have the vocabulary. I don't have the frame of mind to really understand that. It was such a struggle for me. But that's the kind of history that I think, I hope that the new generations will write in the future. We have a lot of those histories out there that are not written. And they need to be here on those shelves. The the 19th century hero architect is already here everywhere. We need the ones who are not here.
Thanks, Fernando. Another one. How do you synthesize Spivak's notion of the subaltern, and how do you see the current critiques to the term informal? Does rethinking either of these terms for the current and future of Latin America bear any potential fruit of discovering the decolonized discourse that you are seeking to define?
Yes, yes. Spivak is fundamental. I deliberately quote only Americans in this lecture and in the text that I'm writing. I mean, I'll tell you another story. The book that I wrote with Carranza, the book on modern architecture in Latin America, got many, many reviews, and it was great. And one of the reviews that I loved the most was written by Francesco Dalcò, the editor of Casabella. And Dalcò wrote that the book is really good, etc., really great. The first book that deals with the whole century, etc., the whole continent. The only problem that he saw in the book is that we do not reference European authors. And great, it was deliberate. We did not, yes. I know the European knowledge, I've read them, but I don't need to reinforce them. So what I'm writing nowadays, I made sure to choose very carefully who I reference, who I quote, in order not to fall back on the Eurocentric narrative of Zizek and Spivak, and it's deliberate. But yes, I read it and I see the idea of subaltern like in the work of the Zapatistas in Chiapas, in the work of some communities in Brazil, in the work of the Aymara in Bolivia. I see the materialization of that subaltern enterprise, that subaltern attitude. And I recognize that it's one of the forces moving forward.
Thank you, Fernando. And for I think this conversation is great, but I think we are kind of running out of time. So we might have the time for one or two questions. So I'm going to get the ones from the Q&A. Maybe we can get some of the ones that are happening on the chat. So here, I'm going to read this one here. All modernity, all modernization is colonial, a strong formulation which I'm largely sympathetic to. But I want to ask first whether there can be forms of grassroots modernization, is that right? Modernization that is modernization not from above but from below. And second, what do you think about forms of modernization that are top-down but are nonetheless conceived in resistance to colonial or formerly powers? So for example, with the non-aligned movement in the 60s and 70s. In other words, even if there is always a subaltern that remains outside of the project and fruits of modernization, do we need a vocabulary more specific than colonialism or neocolonialism to address cases such as project under the non-aligned movement?
Yeah, I want to separate this conversation from the non-aligned movement and the meeting in Indonesia and that historical period. What I learned from Escobar and Mignolo is that every action of modernization brings some colonization, and we just need to be very aware of it. The more aware we are, the more we can avoid the colonization side. For instance, to build a new stadium, who's being displaced? Who's being expelled from their land? To build the vaccine, to design and produce the vaccine, who's being tested? Who's the guinea pig of the vaccines? Who is being thrown under the bus of the COVID pandemic because they don't have the the choice of staying home, they don't have the privilege of staying home, or they don't have the proper equipment to protect themselves from the virus. If we know that there is coloniality in every action of modernity, we can pay attention to those colonial effects and mitigate them. So it's not that we can completely avoid coloniality. We just need to be much more aware of it. So the coloniality of the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, the port of entry for all the Pierre Noir, all the dark-skinned people of North Africa, the coloniality of the labor in Brazil that built all those beautiful concrete structures, the coloniality of the Yunnan being built on top of an ejido, a communal land. So it goes on and on and on. And of course, we probably are being colonial right now in many of the projects that we celebrate. It's the task of being aware or open to the possibility of coloniality and paying attention to who is paying, who is carrying the burden of our actions. So to build electric cars as a possible solution to climate change without real change in our habits, we are mining lithium and we are destroying Bolivia. As Elon Musk said himself, he will coup anyone he can in order to keep the lithium coming to Tesla. So yeah, it's beautiful promises of modernity that can control carbon emissions, but will dump lithium mining byproducts in Bolivia. And it goes on and on.
Thank you, Fernando. Okay, we have one more question. I'm going to wrap up with one more question. Unfortunately, we were not able to get all the questions from the Q&A. So I would like to thank you for this wonderful presentation. I especially appreciate the connections drawn between abstraction, modernism, and colonization. As an educator, as a minority in America, I have seen minority students struggle with abstraction in the studio. I imagine that with your experience, that you experienced that as an educator as well. Can you share any thoughts you might have on how we might develop alternatives to abstraction as a studio paradigm?
Yes, that's another very central question. Here in Austin, we have a Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Of course, I am the only minority full professor, so I am the chair of that committee. It's a burden that I take happily, but we are having exactly this discussion. How can we mitigate the effects of abstraction in the first studio curriculum? I don't have an answer. I don't know how. I think one of the ways to do it is to recognize that students come to school, whether they are 17, 18 for the undergraduates, whether they are 22, 23 for graduate school, they come with a knowledge, they come with a baggage. If they are from South Texas, if they are from East LA, if they are from South Chicago, they come with a experience of the world that is different from students that come from Houston suburbs or some parts of Dallas or the Chicago northern suburbs. How can we recognize that knowledge in studio and make that a motor of invention? That's the key question. That's the key thing. And I don't have an answer. I also, I've been away from studio for a little while directing the PhD program, but I think it's a central question for the years to come. How can we design a studio curriculum, especially beginning design studio, that is really more inclusive, that don't need upper class references all the time.
Fernando, thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity of moderating this panel. This was a great discussion.
Yolande, very good to hear from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Luciana. Great job. And thank you, Fernando. You've given us a lot to ponder, and we'll, I'm sure, be thinking about this as we go into next week and beyond, and look forward to when we can all be in person again, to having you here in person in Los Angeles. So thank you. And
thank you so much.
Everyone out there, join us next week, same time, for our next conversation on that will continue on Latin America next week. So please join us then. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.